Okay, this is all about the search for compromise after the original states, or the original wave of secession, the first wave of secession. It's not the case that it's right. Okay, well, you've left the Union. Let's have a good civil war over it. That's not the case. There are attempts by moderates to ensure, or try to ensure, that a compromise is reached. At this point, Buchanan is what we call a lame duck president. When we use the term lame duck, it's referring to a president in the last months of their presidency before the next guy takes over. Buchanan had promised to only serve one term, and of course, in the election, Abraham Lincoln is the president in waiting. The phrase that we use is president-elect. They've been elected president, but they are not currently in office. They haven't sworn the oath. Lincoln isn't going to become president until his inauguration, which is March of 61. Buchanan is very keen not to take any action that might provoke war with the South. Ultimately, for him, he believes that it is the Republicans' problem to deal with. They created this issue. It's up to them to deal with it. What he doesn't do is he doesn't take any action when the Confederacy begins to seize federal property, so forts and post offices and the like. Not only that, Buchanan doesn't do anything about key forts that are still under federal control. Two key garrisons on the East Coast, we have Fort Sumter, protecting the Charleston Harbour, and Fort Pickens on the South Coast in what we call Pensacola, the south coast of Florida. These are federal garrisons with federal troops living and working in them, but also surrounded by a new nation, the Confederacy. This is key, and it will be crucial because Fort Sumter is attacked by the Confederates, and that is the first act of the American Civil War. Buchanan, this is the last I'm really going to talk about Buchanan. He has been criticised by historians. He's often referred to as one of the worst presidents. At this point, people have criticised him for not doing enough, but other historians have said, well, at this point, is the damage already done? What could Buchanan actually do within his power that is going to stop a conflict? He's coming out of office in a matter of a couple of months. The Republicans in the North don't trust him. The lower South have no interest in rejoining the Union. So we can criticise Buchanan for a lot, but one thing that we could question is the criticism of him at this point. Is there anything he can really do at this stage? Compromise isn't going to come from President Buchanan. It's going to come, hopefully, from the moderate point of view, from Congress. It meets in December 60, and both houses immediately set up committees in an attempt to plan a conciliation to bring the two sides together. Now, the House and the Senate have their own committees. The issue is the House elects 33 of its members to join the conciliation committee. There's too many views, too many differing opinions. They make very little progress. The Senate only has 13 members, however, and it is led by this man, John Crittenden. He's a constitutional unionist, but in the past he had been a Whig and then a know-nothing. He's from the state of Kentucky, where the Constitutional Union Party did very well. He is the perfect person to consider compromise. He's from the Upper South, so he can sympathise with the Southern view, but he is also a unionist and does not want to see the great experiment of self-government fail. He puts together a package known as the Crittenden Compromise. So it's named after him. The first thing that the Crittenden Compromise attempts to do is to extend the Missouri Compromise line across to the Pacific Ocean. Slavery would be recognised in the states where it already exists, but also in territories both present and future. Slavery would be permitted south of the Missouri Compromise line. So that's the first proposal. The second proposal from Crittenden is an amendment to the American Constitution, which guarantees that there would be no interference with slavery where it already exists. Problem with that is it's going to need a majority of Congress and state governments as well. Number 3, Congress would not have the power to abolish slavery in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. Crittenden hopes that those 3 things are going to bring both sides together. Unfortunately, Congress is now dominated by Republicans because Southerners had withdrawn from Congress. And to the Northerners, to ones least likely to compromise, they see these measures not as a compromise but as a surrender to the demands of the South. So Crittenden's proposals largely fall on deaf ears. Fun fact for you now. They often say that the American Civil War is a war of brother against brother. In the Crittenden family, it most certainly was. John Crittenden serves in Congress as a Unionist but a critic of President Lincoln. George Crittenden, his eldest son, pictured left. You may notice from his uniform, George Crittenden is a Confederate Army general in the United States Civil War, whereas his younger son, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, fights in the Union Army and is a Union Army general. So we can see how divisive this conflict is, particularly in the border states. We've got a father who's a Unionist in Congress, but also opposing the president on most issues, and then 2 brothers who are army generals for the opposite sides. So Crittenden's proposals have largely failed, and so the next attempt at compromise is the Virginia Peace Convention of February 1861. It isn't held in Virginia. You can see on the primary source there, it is held in the capital, Washington, D.C. The reason it is named the Virginia Peace Convention is because it was the state of Virginia that first requested this convention be held. And the ultimate aim of this convention is to bring the seceded states back into the Union. In total, there are 133 delegates present at the Peace Convention. There are some big names in American politics there, but crucially, none of which are from the Confederacy. This, to me, suggests that it's doomed from the start. You're holding a convention on peace where one side hasn't even bothered turning up. After 3 weeks of deliberation, they come up with proposals that are similar to Crittenden's. Again, this is going to be ignored by the Republican-dominated Congress and by the Confederacy. This case and the Crittenden Compromise failing probably suggests, I'm inclined to believe, that the 2 sides, the Republicans in the North and the Confederates in the South, they were so diametrically opposed that I think any attempt at conciliation was impossible, was doomed to fail, because they want so fundamentally different things. Moderates are desperately trying to keep the country together, but on the extremes, there is no desire for it. Next up, the reaction of the North. Slavery had dominated American politics, and the status of slavery had dominated American politics right the way through our course. But all of a sudden in 1860, slavery isn't the issue, secession is the issue. Now, I know that secession stems from the issue of slavery, and you could well argue that slavery is still ultimately the great divider of American politics. But the issue of the day is now not the slavery question necessarily, but trying to get the South back into the Union. Now, actually, there are a minority of Northerners who react to secession by saying, well, let's see how they get on their own. Good riddance to bad rubbish. But that is a minority of opinion. Most Americans in the North were unwilling to accept that this was the end of the great experiment in self-government. So most Americans want to do something. They want to see their nation survive. However, only a minority are willing to send troops to put down what they believe to be a rebellion. The appreciation here, if they do so, is that they're going to miss the states that are missing from the map, the Upper South. Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee. Their loyalty to the Union at the minute is being questioned, and it's a shaky loyalty. Ultimately, their loyalty lies with the South, and most in the North know that an act of aggression would see most of those border states leave the Union and join the Confederacy. So most Northerners agree that the best bet at this stage is not to provoke the South and hope that eventually the Southern states will see sense and come back into the Union of their own accord. You might be wondering at this point where Lincoln fits into all this. Currently, he's at home in Illinois waiting to take the office of the presidency. Before he's even taken the office, 7 states have taken it upon themselves to leave the nation. Lincoln is largely silent on the issue of secession prior to becoming president. But one thing he does do on the 1st of February of 61 is he writes a letter to the Senator for New York, William Seward. We're going to talk about Seward in a bit more detail in a minute. He makes it clear in this letter to Seward that he will be willing to compromise with the South on the Fugitive Slave Act and the status of slavery in DC. He's even willing to reconsider New Mexico and go back to the provision of the 1850 Compromise, which said that settlers would be allowed to decide the issue of slavery themselves. But one thing he's absolutely clear that he will not compromise on in his letter to Seward is the issue of slavery expansion. He is firmly and fully committed that there would be no expansion of slavery under his watch. Lincoln is determined not to give in to the South. The problem is he exaggerates the support for the Union in the Confederacy. He mistakenly thought that secession was just the work of a small group of fire-eating politicians, a small group of planters that had whipped the people there up into a frenzy. He'd hoped that eventually Southern Unionists would see sense, they would overthrow this small group of planters, and this would bring them back into the Union in time. This is a naive view. It shows that he doesn't really truly understand the South. However, before he's actually president and he doesn't have power himself, what can he do? There's very little Lincoln can do at this stage. Southerners are not going to respond well to Lincoln reaching out to them. He hasn't even appeared on their ballot paper. Even the Unionists in the South doesn't necessarily mean they're committed to Lincoln, they're committed to the Union. So there's very little at this stage he can do. One thing Lincoln can do is start to come up with the men that he wants in his cabinet. Sorry, I just had to pause there because I quite cruelly forgot about Montgomery Blair. How awful of me. One thing Lincoln's in charge of is choosing the men that's going to make up his cabinet, and he chooses 7 men from different factions, some radical, others moderate, some former Democrats, some former know-nothings. 4 of them had been competitors for the Republican candidacy. In fact, 2 of them were in cabinet because he promised them a job in cabinet if they stood aside and let him run as the nominee. It is the total opposite to Buchanan. Buchanan was rewarding people that had been loyal to him and the Democrat Party for some time. It was very much seen as jobs for the boys. Lincoln has gone out of his way to build what becomes known as a team of rivals. The book that I've highlighted to you by Doris Goodwin is excellent. I read it when I was at college myself. It's really good. It gives you a real good picture of Lincoln as a man, as a person, and why he deliberately went out of his way to pick politicians that he disagreed with on a range of issues. None of them knew him, and he didn't know much about them. He was picking these men on their reputations, and he wanted a variety of opinions. He probably would have had a real Southerner in cabinet if he could find one that was willing, but he couldn't find an appropriate individual. I'm very briefly going to go through our key 7. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, just to give you a background. First of all, we can see Seward, Republican senator for New York from 1840. Well, he had been a former Whig. His wife was a leading abolitionist. He becomes the Secretary of State, the most important position in the executive apart from the president. Next up is Salmon Chase, Secretary for the Treasury. He's the radical in the group. He's from the state of Ohio. He's a former Whig, but also a former Free Soiler as well. Next up, Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy. Gideon Welles was from Connecticut. He'd been a Democrat until 1944. He joined the Free Soilers in 1948 after the Polk presidency. Became a Republican in 1954. Next up, Edward Bates of Missouri. He becomes the Attorney General. He'd been a Whig and then a Know-Nothing and then a Republican. Fun fact about Edward Bates, and it's the only fun fact to have, he's the first cabinet officer that's appointed that's from a state west of the Mississippi River. Next up, the person who I forgot about, I hope he forgives me. Montgomery Blair becomes the Postmaster General. He's from Maryland, so from the Upper South. He had been a Democrat. He left the Democrats in 1954 because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and joins eventually the Republican Party. Caleb Blood Smith becomes Secretary of the Interior from the state of Indiana. He'd been a Whig member of the House of Representatives, a Republican from 1954. My fun fact about Caleb Blood Smith isn't the fact that one of his surnames is Blood, but he is one of the few politicians in American history to serve in the legislature. So he served in Congress, in the House of Representatives. He served the executive in Lincoln's cabinet, but he also served on the courts as well. So he's one of the few politicians in American history to serve in all 3 branches of government. You can save that for a pub quiz or university challenge in future years. And then finally, Simon Cameron, the Secretary for War. He is from the state of Pennsylvania. He was a Democrat, then a Know-Nothing, then a Republican. We've got a range of men with a range of political ideals coming from different parts of the North. Some from the Upper South, because obviously we've got Maryland in there too. The 2 debt appointments, as I'm going to call them, are Caleb Blood Smith and Simon Cameron. Basically, Lincoln said to them at the convention, if you throw your weight behind me and I win, there'll be a place in my cabinet for you. So they were pretty much assured a place in cabinet. The final thing I need to tell you about this difficult team of varied opinions is that many people are doubting Lincoln's ability to control these men. They know very little about him. He knows little about them. They've got a wealth of political experience, and Lincoln is still seen very much as a political outsider. And very few people believe that Lincoln can control this group and expect this administration to be a chaotic and short-lived one. And so, with previous attempts for a compromise both in Congress and at the Virginia Peace Conference, with those 2 attempts failing and his cabinet decided, he sets off in February 1961 from his home state of Illinois, and the landing spot is the nation's capital, DC. He decides that on his way he's going to stop at various points and make speeches so that he can be what's the word? He can be accountable to his people, and they can sort of see what they can expect from him. On his journey from Illinois, and I've lost him. Where have you gone, Abraham? There you are. Get up there. Let's go back. On his journey from Illinois, he gets word that there is an assassination plot against him. And so when he gets to Baltimore, he abandons his planned journey, changes his plans, disguises himself, which for a man well over 6 foot was considerably, a challenge. And he sneaks into the nation's capital anonymously. So he knows from the moment he becomes president, there's a threat against his life. A few things are happening to Lincoln's quite young reputation at this point. First of all, the speeches that he gives on his way to DC are naff. They are rubbish. They tell us very little about what he wants to do. And the reason why is he can't say much at this point. So he's largely disappointing the crowds that are coming to listen to him speak. The second thing is sneaking into the nation's capital suggests something about his courage. People suggesting he was cowardly. I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but certainly at the time, people believed this was a cowardly act and they questioned his bravery. Finally, this strange Western accent and his socially awkward nature added to this mystique and this idea that maybe the American people had made a big mistake by electing this man. So Lincoln's reputation upon arriving in DC is certainly not strong. There are a lot of question marks about him. When he gets to DC, he meets scores of people. Some were potential office seekers who wanted a role in government. Others were congressmen who wanted to make their points of view known to him. And of course, he wanted to meet his new members of cabinet. He begins to work on his inauguration speech. And in doing so, he gives it to certain members of cabinet and key advisors to look over and advise. He particularly relies on the advice of the Senator for New York and his new Secretary of State, William Seward. He persuades Lincoln to soften some of the phrases and to emphasise his conciliatory mood, emphasise that he is willing to compromise if at all possible. And so, this video ends with the inauguration of President Lincoln. You can see the photograph there. This is the second presidential inauguration that was photographed. Buchanan's was the first. On the 4th of March, 1861, Lincoln gives his inauguration speech, and you can see it there. His speech was conciliatory but firm. He agreed that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, or take any immediate action to reclaim federal property or appoint federal officials to federal property in the South. In his view, the Union is unbreakable and secession is illegal. He intended, and I quote, to hold, occupy and possess federal property in the states that had seceded from the Union. This is going to be a problem pretty soon because that involves holding and occupying and possessing Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbour in South Carolina in the Confederacy. And the first cannon fire of the Civil War is going to be fired at Fort Sumter. He actually does pretty well out of this inauguration speech. There were some question marks because of the way in which he entered the Capitol. Republicans are happy with the speech because it took a firm stance on the slavery question. Unionists in the border states and Northern Democrats approved this conciliatory tone, which suggested that he may be willing to compromise on certain issues with the South. The area of the country where this speech has no effect whatsoever is the Confederate States in the South. But really, at this point, what can President Lincoln say to convince them to come back? They had no wish to rejoin the Union. They already had a clear picture in their minds of what Lincoln represented. So anything he said at this stage was going to fall on deaf ears. So it's received well by those within his own party and those in the border states, but very little impact in the South. Next up, we're going to look at Fort Sumter and the outset of the Civil War.